Hello, PorcFest. How's everybody doing? Is anybody excited about this next talk? Hell yeah, hell yeah. Well, we are very pleased to introduce Bob Murphy. Now, Bob is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. He wrote the great book Choice. He wrote the book Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression. And he had the popular podcast, Contra Krugman. Everybody heard about that one? What about his own podcast? The Bob Murphy Show. Anybody like that one? Yeah, I do too. I watch all of it. So, anybody like Secession here? Apparently Bob Murphy likes Secession. So, give it up for the great Bob Murphy.
Well, thank you, Angelo. Thank you, everybody, for coming out here. Before I hop into the main talk here, I was asked to make an announcement because I think it didn't make it into the official schedule. Let me get situated here. So the film, The Bubble, it's about the big housing bubble and so on. I think they're doing a screening of that tomorrow. It starts at 7 in the media room. Is that called The Anthem? Okay, The Anthem. And then after, there's going to be a panel. Gene Epstein and Tom Woods for sure are going to be there. I don't know if I can make that one. They're both quoted in the movie, and that's from 8:20 through 9. So if you want to check that out, it's going to be happening tomorrow. Before I get into the main talk, let me just go over something. Have any of you gotten these like bootleg brochures? Okay, so yeah, I was out there, and I asked back there, and they said we don't have officially printed up schedules, but there's kids walking around. So some girl comes up to me. She says, "Hey, do you want to buy a schedule?" And I said, "Sure." It was $5. And I opened it up, and I was surprised to see an essay from me in here. And so at this point, I'm thinking, she should have given me $5, right? And then, okay, fair enough. I don't believe in IP, fair enough. But then I see, did you guys see this cartoon? So for those who don't know, and for the recording, it shows 3 people who look very similar. I'll just leave it at that. And they're walking into what's the restaurant from Seinfeld, and the caption says, Tom Woods, Bob Murphy, and George Costanza walk into a restaurant. So I think it's somehow conveying that we're similar in some respect, but it's stupid, right? Because number one, Contra Krugman, it was just the 2 of us. It wasn't George Costanza. And Tom and I are both senior fellows at Mises, but George Costanza isn't, right? So this joke, it doesn't really even make sense. So, But on a more serious note, I actually retired. I used to perfect my George Costanza for obvious reasons, and just dealing with the hand I was dealt. And I was one time at the Mises Institute. We were speaking to a high school crowd. it was for high school kids, and this was 10 years ago. And so I got there, and for some reason I went into the cassette, and I was really selling. I was going, George is getting very angry, and I was really selling. And I looked, and the kids are just nothing. And later, a dad comes up with his daughter, and he's like, "Hey, Dr. Murphy, I like your talk." And I was telling my daughter there used to be this show Seinfeld, and you did an impeccable impression of one of the characters. And she was like, "Oh, then I liked your talk." And so I realized at this point that no, the Seinfeld references, but apparently they're still alive. So I do appreciate that. Okay, so let me. Obviously, what I'm talking about here is just to get the cat out of the bag. I won't shock anyone here. I have come to the conclusion that I really want to put my weight behind. I'll choose a different metaphor. Put my energy behind secession, and I'm focusing on Texas. And so let me just explain partly how I came to that conclusion. So what I'll do is, I don't know exactly how long these points will go, but if I wrap up and we still have time, then I'll field your guys' questions. So let me just sort of give you an idea of how I got to this point. So the theory of it, or the principle, do people have the right to leave a political organization that they no longer agree with? I mean, it's ironic that has such a bad connotation in the U.S. political context, because that is a pretty standard thing. The right to self-determination, that's one of the bedrock principles of classical liberalism, and yet for various reasons that we maybe can get into later in the talk, that has been given a bad name, where that's associated with, nefarious characters. So by me saying I've come around to this, I don't mean that I was ever against it in principle. I just meant it wasn't something that I personally was going to get behind. But lately, I've thought this is not only something that is, something that in principle makes sense, but that I'm personally going to, try to publicize and draw people's attentions to. So let me just give you some of the context of where I'm coming from. As you know, I'm an economist, and so most of my work since 2008, I have been going around warning people about what the Federal Reserve has been doing. So for coming up 2 decades at this point, I have been very concerned about the future of the U.S. dollar, and then also somewhat related to what the U.S. Treasury has been doing, how much debt they've been stockpiling, and that those trends have continued. So let me just give you some of these statistics here. And this is all standard stuff. This isn't like you have to go to Shadow Stats website or something. This is all pretty standard stuff. The CBO's latest report says that right now the federal debt as a share of GDP is 102%. Okay, so for those of you who know, like it wasn't, it was more like in the 70s and 80s, not that long ago, and the projections were, it might surpass 100%, in the far-flung future. And no, we've zoomed past that, and the deficit this year alone is 10% of the size of the economy, right? So the mismatch in how much the federal government is spending above and beyond what they're taking in tax revenues is 10% of the entire economic output just this year. To give you some context, that's the third highest, since 1945, right? The highest since 1945 was last year. So you can see that you have to go back to World War II and the tremendous spending the federal government did then to equal what the federal government has done last year and this year, when we're not fighting a world war. And I could say, it was a coronavirus or whatever, but still the fact that it's this year, you can see, with the Biden administration coming out with their infrastructure plans, at this point, just throwing out multi-trillion-dollar spending programs is like it's nothing, okay? The other thing, too, about this, if you go and look into the CBO's report, it's not, so after World War II, if you look at the graph, the federal debt as a share of the economy goes way up during World War II, and then it comes down. So it's not that the federal government ran a budget surpluses, but it's just the deficits got kind of small, and then the economy outgrew the debt, right? So the absolute dollar figure of how many billions the federal government was in debt kept going up little by little, but the economy was growing faster, so that's why as a share of GDP, it slowly shrunk in the 50s and 60s. Now, though, it's just like this, right? So, and why is that? It's because the fundamentals are all screwed up right now, that the federal government has accumulated many trillions of dollars of extra debt just since 2008 at a time when interest rates were really low, like virtually 0% for short-term debt. So the interest cost on that debt has been fairly negligible, right? Because interest rates have been so low. So it's sort of like if you're, to put it in a household context, if you keep getting 0% balance transfer offers on your credit cards and you just keep rolling it over, you can be spending like crazy and running up huge debts, and it doesn't really hurt. Like, you don't feel the full pain of that as long as you keep getting new offers in the mail to, transfer your balances over here, 0%, plus the fee or whatever. It's not that big a deal. But then once those offers stop coming and, you start getting charged 19% APR, then all of a sudden the ramifications of what you've done, really come home to roost. So that's what's going on here in terms of the CBO projections. So they're saying by 2050, the federal debt will be about 200% of the economy. And that's not because they're factoring in like a big crash or, some new pandemic down the road. That's just baked into the cake. That's just the way the numbers are. If interest rates just gradually go back to more historical levels, you can just see that, the charts, like in terms of federal spending and the components, net interest on the debt just grows and grows, right? So just the idea of servicing the debt we already have is going to become one of the biggest federal programs, is just paying interest on the existing debt. And that's just autopilot, right? So again, this isn't like building in scary scenarios. It's not like going to LouRockwell.com and saying, what do they say is going to happen? This is just the number crunchers doing standard assumptions about, as the economy goes back to normal, interest rates will somewhat rise, and therefore, and that's what happens. So again, this is on autopilot at this point, that the federal debt is going to double again relative to the economy just in a few decades. Then when you look at what the Federal Reserve has been doing, let me just give you a couple more statistics here. So as you probably know, after the housing bubble crisis, the financial crisis in 2008, the Fed did 3 rounds of what was called QE, quantitative easing. And if you looked at a chart of the Fed's balance sheet, it was like boom, 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 right? It was huge increases. If you are a fan of Glenn Beck, he had like a forklift on his show to show visually and he was growing, and then the forklift went up just to show the chart in late 2008, just to give a sense of visually how much money the Fed had been printing because of the financial crisis back in 2008 and going forward. And so what the Fed did starting last March dwarfed that. So now if you look at a graph, you can't really see as well what the Fed did after 2008 because it gets scrunched down to make room for what they just did last year. So just from last March through this March, the Fed created $3.3 trillion in what's called base money. So the Fed went out and bought $3.3 trillion in assets in a 12-month span. And to give you a frame of reference, that was 78%, right? So its balance sheet grew 78% just in those 12 months. All right, so again, just dwarfing any 12-month movement, up to that point. So let me just back up a second. So in terms of standard Austrian business cycle theory, why is that a problem? So yes, that's monetary inflation. You can view that as them stealing purchasing power from everybody else. They're just creating money electronically. So that's all true in terms of the morality of it. But in terms of just the economics, so Austrians believe that the business cycle is caused by easy money policies, artificially cheap credit. Businesses borrow funds, they invest in long-term projects based on those false interest rates. That causes an unsustainable boom, and then eventually there's a crash. All right, and so, and this isn't just the theory. Like, you can fit this to the facts of the housing bubble, for example, quite well. You can just see how the housing bubble blew up in the 2003 to 2006, right when the Fed had really low interest rates. Then the Fed started raising rates because inflation started getting out of hand, and then the housing bubble turned around and crashed. All right, so this isn't merely like, we Austrians have our theory, but it doesn't apply to the real world. It fits very well. And I went around giving presentations to like normal investment people, people in the financial sector, starting in 2008 and 2009, just showing them these charts. I wasn't even calling it Austrian business cycle theory. I was just saying, here's what I think happened, and it was very compelling. And they would come up after and say, wow, I hated economics in school, but what you just said made sense, and it scared the crap out of me. So, all right, so I'm saying I was scaring people, and I didn't even show them, what just happened in last year. Okay, so what they did last year dwarfs what they did beforehand. So let me put it to you this way. So there was the dot-com crash, which Austrians, would say was caused by loose money in the late 90s. That caused the dot-com bubble and crash in the early 2000s. Alan Greenspan was the Fed chair at the time. He brought interest rates down to 1%. The housing bubble blew up. They started raising rates. There was a big crash. Then, again, QE, they brought interest rates down to 0, left them there for 7 years, and then started raising rates. 2 summers ago, the yield curve inverted, if you know what that terminology means. And so I and plenty of others were saying, okay, a big crash is coming. Now, there was a big crash. Unemployment went up to like 14% temporarily, but it happened right when the corona stuff came in. So it was perversely, because that was so bad, I think it sort of let the Fed off the hook. That I think, in other words, even if corona had never happened, I think last summer there would have been an awful economic crash because of the Fed had been gently raising rates, and I think the effects of all the QE would have manifested themselves at that point, but it sort of got swept under the rug because, corona, and then they brought interest rates down to 0, and then, like I say, printed even more money or electronically created more money. So I think they've sown the seeds and blown up another bubble that, again, is going to crash at some point. So with all this stuff, they kind of have boxed themselves into a corner. They have to raise interest rates at some point, or else the dollar's going to crash. But if they start raising rates, they've got all this outstanding debt. Okay, so just in terms of the pure fiscal and monetary stuff, it's quite alarming, and it's sort of shocking the corner into which they've painted themselves. Right? If we just had those trends, I would be very alarmed. Like I said, going around warning people, there's a big crash coming. This country needs to get ready for some serious social strife. Beyond all that stuff, though, some other things the Fed did last year, just to tell you while we're sitting here, they got rid of reserve requirements. I don't know if that was on your radar. So up till last year, there had been a rule saying commercial banks need to keep a certain portion of checking account balances in the vault. All right, so when you go into a real quick thing here. When you go into a bank and you give them $100 to put in your checking account, they don't just put it in a drawer with your name on it. right? They lend most of it out. And I'm saying, but before, there had been a rule that they had to keep roughly 10%, depending on the specifics, on reserve, like, money in the vault or on deposit with the Fed or, in the ATMs to have that cash there. Last, I think it was in March, they got rid of that requirement. So now technically the banks don't need to hold any money in reserve. And the way they announced it was a little bit funny. So it was on a Sunday. It was an emergency announcement from the Fed. And the official announcement just had a remark at the end saying, we've made some other changes, refer to this document to see what that is. And then you had to go to that document, and then the very last thing, they said, oh, by the way, we got rid of reserve requirements effective next month. Right? So it was a pretty low-key announcement. Now, strictly speaking, it doesn't matter right now because they also, back in fall of 2008, started paying banks to not make loans to people. They called it paying interest on reserves. So the banks were sitting on a bunch of reserves anyway. So in the grand scheme, the effect didn't matter too much when they did it, but I think they were just clearing the way to just make it easier for banks to do to engage in more reckless lending down the road. Another little seeming arcane thing they did was they switched to what's called average inflation targeting. They did that I think last August. So I'll be real brief on this, but previously the Fed would just announce here's our targets for inflation, like 2%. And now they switched it to say, we just on average over a certain period of time want to hit it. And so what that means is if it's been undershooting, then they need to overshoot the target so that on average it's higher. So I think what they're doing is they're rhetorically giving themselves room to let the economy run hot for a few years, right? So I think they know, even by their own metrics, which are goofy, that price inflation is going to be higher than what they say their official goal is. But they've now, changed this to say, oh, no, we're supposed to let it run hot for a few years while the economy gets back on track. So there's just lots of little things like that where they've made little changes. And then more generally, they just keep expanding the type of asset the Fed can buy, right? So before the financial crisis of 2008, generally the Fed bought treasury bonds or, of treasury assets of various maturities. And the idea, like if the Fed going out and buying bonds from just regular corporations, that would have been scary. That would have been like, oh, no, that's corruption. You can't have the central bank just going out and buying bonds from Wall Street because, look at the avenues for corruption. They started doing that last March. Right? I mean, they announced it, and they started doing it in the summer. Okay, so right now, the Fed can buy student loans. Your auto loans can get packaged into asset-backed securities that the Fed can own, regular credit card debt. Right, so basically, just about any asset you can think of right now, the Fed has a legal means to go ahead and buy that stuff. All right, so they can print money and bail out any sector they want. So just again, I think they're just paving the way for them to be able to print money as they hit rocky terrain. Okay, and then the other thing too is there's what's called MMT, modern monetary theory. I am not going to get into it right here in the Q&A. If somebody wants to go into it, we can talk about it there, but. This is really taken over. Just a show of hands. Do people know what MMT is? Okay, all right. I'm at PorcFest. Great. All right, so I don't need to go over this stuff. Okay, it's bad. All right, I disagree very strongly. Okay, so it's sort of like if James Lindsay, and he has a math PhD, and he literally on Twitter has been arguing with people that 2 + 2 = 4. I'm not. You might, if you don't know about this, you think, oh, Bob's exaggerating. No, really, what's the argument? I swear to you. Literally, math PhDs are arguing about whether 2 + 2 = 4. And he's saying, yes, it does. And they're saying, but maybe not. Right? And so that's what it is. And I'm saying that MMT is like that to me in terms of economics. And but it has taken, it's taking hold. It's taken root such that, more and more people are talking about. So all these trends, what I'm getting at is I think it's at the point where we're not just going to walk back from these huge deficits and printing money. And also, too, in fairness, guys like me were warning about price inflation early on, 2009, and we've apparently been discredited, right? If you go to my Wikipedia article, apparently I was born, I lost an inflation bet, and then at some point I'm going to die, and that's going to be my life in terms of, and I did a podcast with Tom. That's like my thing. So, I can see how if you genuinely just thought, well, no, maybe printing trillions of dollars is fine. Who's to say? So that's what I'm saying, like this sort of postmodernist, like, hey, who can say that, we don't know that 2 + 2 = 4. Likewise, maybe printing trillions of dollars and letting politicians spend it is a good idea. Let's see what happens. Like that, I'm being tongue in cheek a little bit, but that's literally, what they're saying. All these critics have been warning about this for years. So I'm saying, until there's a major crash or problem that we see, gasoline go up to $5 a gallon, I don't think they're going to stop. Right? It's not like common sense is going to kick in and they're going to pull back. As you can see, this stuff is all built in. And now at this point, like I say, they're just going to keep running it until they see some reason to stop. Okay, so let me pivot away from that. So again, just my bread and butter issues, the stuff where I'm trained on. I have been worried about that stuff for a decade plus, and now I'm very alarmed by these trends. But it's sort of like that's almost faded into the background in terms of some of the social culture war stuff. So here, since this isn't my area, I'm just going to mention a few of these things just to sort of connect the dots in case some of you haven't thought of it this way. But you've got like the defund the police movement. Now, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I actually had a podcast episode saying the right way to defund the police, right? So I was telling, people on the left who want to defund the police, hey, I've written a book on this. Here you go, right? So thank you. All right, so if you go check my vehicles in the parking lot, it doesn't have a Blue Lives Matter, right? That's not who I am, but I'm just being realistic. In the current environment, there's several things going on simultaneously that could be linked in a way that's not going to be good. So at the same time, you've got, across the country, like calls to defund the police. What that's going to do, of course, is going to lead to, certain people are still going to commit crimes. And so if the local police aren't in charge of fighting it, I think that's going to pave a way for the feds to come in and sort of take care of it. And at the same time, you've got the movement to purge the military, the armed forces of this dangerous white right-wing white supremacist militia group type mentality, right? So these things, it's looking to me like part of what could be going on is they're trying to set it up so that to go in and start implementing gun control, for example. Certain communities where they weren't on board with that, and like the local sheriffs or whatever who wouldn't participate, well, if they've been gutted and so they're sort of neutered, and then people can come in, and that branch of the armed forces has also been rendered politically correct. You can see what I'm saying. So again, these things, it's not going to happen next Tuesday. But if you were worried about what's the country going to look like 10 years from now, there's certain things that have been set in motion that individually just look like, oh, that's kind of weird, or I don't know. But if they're all compatible with each other and they're all working together for something 10 years from now, and you think through what might that be, it's not good for the people coming to this festival. Put it that way. All right. Just some other things. Again, this isn't anybody who's watching this stuff, but let me just point it out. There is rhetorically, the ground has been paved open for using violence against people who disagree with you politically. All right, so early on, if you saw the thing, Richard Spencer was given a talk to someone, and some guy just comes up and sucker punched him, and then Punch a Nazi was trending on social media, right? And it wasn't like people were saying, okay, he shouldn't have punched him, but still, I'm not losing. No, it wasn't like that. It was like, yeah, he was saying horrible things. Of course that guy should have decked him, right? And so that actually kind of surprised me. I mean, I was this was like 2 years ago. I was, naive at that point, but I actually thought, oh, surely they're going to do the blanket, sort of token condemnation of political. No, they weren't doing that at all. It was like, yeah, the guy's a jerk. He's saying awful things. He should get punched. That'll teach other people not to share those views, right? So there's that stuff. Just recently, have you guys seen how the Fort Lauderdale, the gay pride parade, someone lost control of a vehicle and it killed some people? And so, what happened, or the way it was reported, so it was thehill.com was the one that I saw, and maybe some other media outlets did too, but the headline said, Fort Lauderdale mayor, this was a domestic terrorist attack on the LGBT community, and that was the headline, and then you click the story, actually said, witnesses, however, said that the driver was part of the gay men's choir and had told police as such, and the leader of the gay men's choir told police, yeah, this was our driver, it was an accident. That was in the story, and yet the headline still said hours later, Fort Lauderdale Mail, this was a domestic terrorist attack, right? And, with Donald Trump, they would say claims without evidence, right? But here, there was no disclaimer, there was none of that, right? So again, I'm just saying it is clear to me that, the media is really stoking tensions between groups and trying to provoke hatred, and this is not going to end well. So again, this is pretty standard stuff, but I'm just saying all of these things, like in a regular environment, okay, yeah, maybe there's going to be some, people who get drunk and go get into a bar fight or something because people are but if this is the social climate when all of a sudden the economy crashes and unemployment goes back up to 15%, you can see how this is a pressure cooker. Okay, so that's sort of the background of why I think it really is important that we start getting some exit options on the table. And part of why I want to promote this discussion is I think stuff's going to split apart anyway. Like if the economy crashes, if the dollar is to crash, and again, I'm not saying this stuff's going to happen next Thursday, but I'm saying the way they've put these policies in place, I don't see them just walking back from the edge because common sense reasserts itself. I think it's going to take a crash before things come back to normal, at least. And so I believe when money from Washington, D.C. gets cut off, a lot of states are going to break away anyway, right? And so I think it makes sense to go ahead and start the discussions to get some of the logistical framework in motion so that people aren't running around trying to deal with that when cities are on fire again. Right, so that's where I'm coming from and why I want to start promoting this discussion now. And also just to kind of get people used to the idea to sort of disarm literally and figuratively the knee-jerk objections that there might be to it, right? So just kind of get it out on the table that, hey, if we were to leave, you wouldn't kill us, right? Is that cool? And to like have them be on record say, oh yeah, we wouldn't just murder you for leaving. Yeah, go ahead. And then when we do it, they say, well, we didn't think you were serious, right? So that's part of it. Okay, so and why am I focusing on? So that's the idea of why I think secession is something that we really need to shine a spotlight on and elevate in terms of the discussion. And then I'm picking Texas in particular, and if the Q&A you want to mention other ones too, certainly that's perfectly reasonable. It's not that I'm against other ones doing it, but the reason I think Texas makes a lot of sense is so number one, just its history. That it was a republic beforehand. It wasn't just a colony. Like it was an independent country and then joined the Union that way. So there's that history. I've talked to I lived in Texas. I taught at Texas Tech for a few years. So I've been down there, and the culture really is different if you've never been there. For example, in their schools they learn a lot about Texas history. Whereas I grew up in upstate New York. I don't know much about New York State. We just learned U.S. history, right? If someone from Texas is traveling in Europe and someone over there says, where are you from? They'll probably say Texas. They won't say I'm American or I'm from the U.S. They'll say I'm from Texas, right? So I'm just saying that's the way a lot of them think. And so it naturally makes sense that if any group of Americans is going to be able to pull this off relatively peacefully and stress-free, I think that that's a great place to focus on. If Texas were to leave right now and become its own country, at least as of 2016 numbers, I haven't checked the most recent ones, it would have the 10th largest economy in the world, right? Just to give you an idea of how big Texas is, right? Texas just physically is huge. I frequently would make the drive from Houston to Lubbock, so Houston's like in the south and Lubbock is in West Texas, and that was an 8-hour drive. Okay, so again, it's a big area, so you can see logistically why they could very well be their own country. I mean, obviously, you can have little countries too, but I'm just saying Texas is huge. There's nothing weird about it being its own country and it being able to fund itself and survive as an independent nation. Also, just logistically, the fact that it has access to the oceans and then the southern border with Mexico makes it a much more viable candidate for just breaking apart from the Union, whereas, some interior state, it would be harder, like some state right in the middle of the country to be its own thing. That would be a little bit awkward. And even Florida, it has access to the water, but if things went south, and the U.S. Navy wanted to blockade it, that could be tricky. Whereas, again, Texas, if the U.S. government wanted to mess with them, as long as Texas was friendly with Mexico, then the U.S. government would have to get involved with another country to, if they want to have hostilities, right? So lots of reasons, just logistically speaking, Texas breaking away if they did it in a very responsible, peaceful manner. I think it would be tricky for the U.S. federal government to oppose that, where it'd be a lot easier for them to oppose some other interior state doing it. A couple reasons, why I think this would be a very good thing to happen in terms of the values and stuff that we have. So one thing, it would just be like releasing a pressure valve. So like I say, I think going forward, there's going to be strong efforts for gun control, for example. Like you've seen his recent thing about People talking about the tree of liberty being refreshed with the blood of patriots, but you're going to need nuclear weapons and AR-15s or whatever or tanks, whatever he said. And of course, a lot of people on my social media are like, yes, please. Okay. Yeah. Check. Yep. We're with you on that one, Joe. And so it's, they really are, I think, laying the foundation, challenging, like the Second Amendment was never, you couldn't own cannons. So they're getting ready to go through, and they're not going to necessarily do it like it was an outright confiscation, because they're also doing it with, more insidious means of linking it to like mental health issues and stuff. So it would be more like, oh, here's the warning signs. Notice if your neighbor is one of these right-wing delusional people, who's into militias or whatever, and make sure you call someone so we can get them help. And of course, with red flag laws, if they happen to have a gun, we would take that away before they hurt themselves, right? So that's, the way they may usher this stuff in, so to sort of just isolate the kind of people they don't want to have guns before they, put in place something else. So my point is, rather than having, these groups of people all spread out the country sort of holding up, getting ready and saying, well, I'm drawing a line in the sand, and if they do this, then, that's it. I think it just makes more sense for those people to have somewhere to go, like Texas, to, buy more time and just to sort of have a peaceful separation. All right, so that's partly where I'm coming from, that I think violence is coming, and this is a way to try to minimize that as best we can, right, to give people a place to go. Another major benefit of this, you may have heard of the idea of voting with your feet. Okay, so right now, partly why, for example, if California or New York raise their state income tax too much, people move to other states like, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, that don't have an income tax, right? But still, no matter where you go in the U.S., you have to pay the federal income tax. And if you don't want to pay the federal income tax, you'd have to be willing to leave the country. And for a lot of people, that's a pretty high barrier. And so, because of course, everyone here pays their federal taxes. We all do that. I'm on camera, right? So, but notice that, if Texas were to secede and be its own country, and they have, they had a low income tax or none, ideally, then that would give, people a place, at that point, Americans in the other remaining states to emigrate to Texas, the Republic of Texas, and it would still feel like, America to them. It would be less of a culture shock than to have to go to, Mexico or Canada. And so that would not only give a benefit to the people who move, but it would also help everybody else, right? So this isn't merely me talking about, benefiting people who are willing to go down to Texas, but the federal government then wouldn't be able to be as aggressive with some of the tax hikes and other things that they're openly talking about, the corporate income tax hikes and things like this, that they want to do if they knew that, oh, wait a minute, we're going to lose a lot of people that would move to this other place, right? So that's just another reason to sort of keep it in check. As far as, let me just move on here, because I see we're running out of time and I want to leave time for your questions. So as far as the logistics, so here, this is just me speculating, but I personally think what they could do is something like having periodic referendums, or is it referenda? It might be referenda. And just say, like, if 2/3 of the eligible voters in Texas want to leave the union, then that's what we're going to do. We're going to have an independent, right? So it's kind of a high bar, but so that there's no ambiguity. Because what you wouldn't want to have happen is like to have it just be strict majority, and then 51% vote to leave and 49% vote to stay, and then there's haggling over the numbers, the voting, and then people might allege that, oh, the leave side was being very hostile and threatening, and so you wouldn't want there to be a pretext that for the other people in the other states, that if Washington wanted to get hostile about it, you wouldn't want there to be any pretext that the vote was cooked, right? So that's why I think something like 2/3, where it would be crystal clear. But notice too, in the meantime, like if people knew that was a viable option, other people could move to Texas, right? People who thought Texas should leave and who were borderline, not happy with where they were anyway, that would give them an extra kick in the pants to move down to Texas. So the next time one of these referenda came up, they could go ahead and vote, right? So keep that in mind. It's not that the existing people right now, it could be lots of people moving there to then participate and say, yes, let's go ahead and have an independent Texas. So that's, again, there's nothing principled about 2/3, but that just, to me, that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to say. As far as like, Social Security, Medicare, like what about the federal debt? Like just logistically, wait a minute, there's a big federal debt. If everybody in Texas leaves, like how does that work? Do they have to pay some of the debt, or, do they still get their Medicare? How does that work? So here, I just want to defer it and say right now, people can leave the United States, right? You can go move to France if you want to, right? And what if you're 59 and you've been paying into Social Security and Medicare your whole career, and then you move over there? What happens? Do you forfeit all of your stuff, right? And so I'm not going to bore you now, but you go look at, there's protocols in place, right? For you, how do you receive their payments if you move to a different country, change your citizenship? So I'm saying here, logistically, what would happen is the way they could handle it is just say all of a sudden, if the 2/3 vote goes through, let's say, and Texas formally leaves, then Texas is now an independent country, and the people who wanted to would then have their citizenship go to, now they're citizens of the Republic of Texas. And so it would just be handled the same way as if, someone from Texas right now moved to France. It's just they went to a different country. It happens to be Texas, right? So again, we don't, there's nothing in principle that's different about this. It's just a lot of people would be doing it at the same time, right? So it's a matter of degree, but in terms of the principles, it's the same kind of thing. There's nothing logistically they say, oh, you can't do it because, what about Social Security? Another thing that I think is critically important if they were to do this is that the people who didn't want it to leave and who want to remain U.S. citizens should have no negative repercussions, right? So you're still someone living in Austin or Houston, but you're a citizen of the United States, and it's just that you're now working and living abroad, right? It just happens to be the Republic of Texas. Just like somebody right now can go, if you get a good job offer in Canada, you can go up there and you're still a U.S. citizen, and it's not that, you're treated like a peon up there, right? In fact, everyone's very polite. It's Canada, right? So that's the way I think it should work. And so anybody who stays in Texas and wasn't in favor of it, or who just doesn't want to transfer their citizenship, nothing bad should happen to them, right? In other words, their property's fine. It's not that, their neighbors look down on them. And that's critical, number one, because it's the right thing to do. But also, two, again, if this is going to work, you don't want to give up any pretext whatsoever to the people who would want to, disparage the movement or, label it with negative connotations. And so, again, it's got to be above board, and everyone has to see that, okay, yeah, a bunch of the 2/3 of people wanted to move, wanted to change their political orientation, and the remaining ones, were not persecuted in any way. So there's no pretext. There's no reason anybody else could object besides just saying, well, we don't want you to be able to determine your own political destiny, which would be a hard thing for them to say in terms of the Declaration of Independence and so forth. Okay, so that's what I think about that. Let me just mention, let me handle a few objections people might raise, not necessarily people in this room, and then remaining time, I'll turn to your guys' questions. So one thing, for whatever reason, once this comes up, people always say, didn't the Civil War settle this? Which is a weird thing. Imagine if somebody was saying, hey, I look at the state of Native Americans, how they're treated in the United States right now. Nobody would say, well, didn't the Trail of Tears settle that? What are you talking about? Right? That not only would that be wrong, but that'd be horrifying if somebody talked like that. And yet, for some reason, the fact that, a bunch of people got slaughtered in the 1860s all of a sudden proves that you don't have the right to do that, right? So that's kind of a goofy thing to say. Some people, more conservative types, might object and wonder, is it legal? So especially for the talk right here, I'm not going to get into it. I think there are legal scholars who make very compelling arguments to show that the states or the colonies when they entered into the Articles of Confederation, and then what happened when they went into the Union under the Constitution, that they were not just giving carte blanche and saying from now on, we're compelled to do this. This isn't a biblical covenant. It's not like with marriage when you say, for better or worse, till death do us part, right? It's a specific arrangement. So even if you thought, okay, yes, it was an arrangement and we have to abide by our, the states that joined have to abide by, well, the federal government hasn't respected the Constitution by any stretch. Right? And so clearly, even if you thought it was a contract, well, if the other party keeps violating the terms, then the contract's null and void, one might argue. Just, briefly, the stuff with Clapper lying about, collecting bulk data. You have the New York Times, my sort of favorite thing to point out when people wonder, do you live in a free country? The New York Times had a front page article during the Obama years saying how the president has a secret kill list. Right? Crucial 3 words, a secret kill list. Now you might say, what's a secret kill list? Oh, I'll tell you. It's a list of people that the federal government is trying to kill that it keeps secret. Hence the name. right? Now you might think like, oh, there's some euphemism they use, like obscure heartbeat-ending compilation. No. The New York Times headline called it a secret kill list, right? And it was talking about, and it said something like, tests the president's constitutional scruples, or it was something like that, but it was like, Obama feels bad having to have a secret kill list, but what are you going to do, right? And at some point in the article, it did address the constitutionality of it, because you might have thought, surely before the government can just kill you, there's going to be a trial or something. And it said, no, they had like a legal team. The executive branch had its own legal counsel that would review the list and sign off on it or not. So that was the due process, that before they would kill you, they would think about it. All right? So, again, this was the front page. When I was younger, I would have predicted if, the New York Times ran a headline saying the president had a secret kill list, that people would be upset. But as we all know, when you're young and naive. All right, so also just on that point, I thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, not because I thought the government was incapable of lying, but I thought, well, if they got caught lying about invading a country on the basis of bogus intelligence, they would get in trouble, right? Like, you wouldn't get reelected. No, you would. All right. So in any event, my point, though, being is clearly the federal government has not been abiding by the Constitution. Another example, when Obamacare was being debated, some conservative pundit, like I think he was a reporter for like some right-wing magazine, catches Nancy Pelosi, and he asks her, saying, Speaker Pelosi, where in the Constitution does it give the federal government the power, the authority to compel people to buy health insurance? And she went, are you serious? Are you serious? She said, like, go look it on YouTube, and you see that, like, she's annoyed. She can't even believe, like, what kind of stupid question is that? Right? So, again, it's not that, they have, oh, well, see, where it was is in this area. It's the general welfare. Just, like, absurd to her. The idea that she would have to show where in the Constitution it gives them the authority to do this. Give me a break. Right? So, clearly, they're not respecting the Constitution. And so, therefore, even if you thought, okay, but, for us to break away, is that breaking the law? They're not obeying, they're not abiding by their terms of the contract, if that's the way you want to think about it. I guess the last thing I'll mention here is, the obvious thing about, oh, well, gee, isn't, secession sort of like linked with slavery? And so, historically it was, but you know what? The American independence, the Americans owned slaves, or some of them did at that point, and yet we don't associate the, 4th of July with slavery, right? So there's that element. There's been plenty of secessionist movements. Brexit's a recent one. Catalonia, there's a secessionist movement there to break away from Spain. Quebec, there's a secessionist movement there to break away from the rest of Canada, right? So the idea of one group of people wanting to disassociate from a broader political organization, yes, in the U.S. it has the connotation of slavery because of the American Confederacy in the 1860s, but that's just one example of this particular tool being used. And so, yeah, there's no intrinsic reason for those two things to be linked. But also, too, that's why, so for our purposes, I'm using the term secession. But in general, yeah, I think it should just be called, like, the move for Texas independence, which is what it is, just like the 4th of July is American independence, even though that was a secessionist movement. Okay, so I will stop there, and I think we've got 8 minutes for questions.
So,
yeah.
My understanding is that the Federal Reserve controls the interest rate on overnight loans and the interest rate they pay on excess reserves. So my question is, when we say the Fed is manipulating interest rates, which interest rates does it directly control, and what are the practical ways that those affect the broader economy? Okay, so the question is, which interest rates does the Fed control? So the Fed literally directly, in terms of setting the price, there's what's called the discount window. So if you directly borrow money from the Fed, it's through what's called the discount window. So the discount rate they set, just like a merchant can charge $8 for a hat or whatever. So that's the Fed can directly set that. The Fed targets what's called the federal funds rate. So that's the overnight rate of loans on reserves between banks. But the Fed can't literally control that. What it does is it adjusts the amount of reserves in the system. So the way the Fed in practice sets interest rates is it buys and sells assets, and that either creates or destroys reserves, and then because of supply and demand, that changes interest rates. So
generally speaking, economists think central banks have more control over short-term rates because if the Fed prints a bunch of money to push down rates, and that makes people think inflation's going to be higher in the future, then people, if they're lending money, want to get paid a higher interest rate on long-term loans because they're worried about price inflation. So that's why the Fed has less control over long-term rates because inflation expectations kind of offset what it's trying to do. So, but ultimately, like the Central Bank of Zimbabwe, lost control, right? So right now, partly the reason the Fed has such control is people trust it, that it's not going to be completely irresponsible, but I think over time, people's faith is waning. Uh-oh, did you write it out?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to make sure I could get it clear.
Is it an iambic pentameter?
No, it's not too long. I just wanted to say, so like Texas, California has a notable culture and label within America as Californians, and they're recognizable, elsewhere abroad as well. They also have a sizable economy and landmass. So my question is, do you feel like California has similar suitabilities for secession like Texas, or if not, what notable differences would you have?
Okay, so yeah, great question. So you're right. On paper, a lot of the reasons I said they would be true. I guess the one major difference is the sort of culture war stuff that I touched on and I didn't dwell on. I think people in Texas are more likely to object to that as opposed to people in California. Having said that, back for the last election, had Trump won, then you would have seen, there really were, was it Cal Exit, and there was Texit, and Cal Exit was a thing. And so, yes, if Trump, or depending on your things, if they had acknowledged that Trump won, then if they hadn't cheated, then there would have been a budding secessionist movement. So my quick answer is I'm not focused on California, and partly like the big difference, the Texas, being an independent republic. But yeah, you're right. But I think more people in Texas, or the culture of Texas is more likely to want to leave than California in the next 3 or 4 years.
Hi, Bob. A lot of the audience is from the deep blue neoliberal technocratic hellhole known as Massachusetts.
Yep.
And,
we're actually from Massachusetts too right now. I mean, I wasn't born there, but yeah.
I was wondering if there is a case to be made to show solidarity with autonomy and liberation movements coming from the left as a secessionist from the right.
Say that. You're saying to tell people in Massachusetts, don't rub shoulders with these low-tax clowns?
Is there a pragmatic case to be made to show solidarity with those autonomy and liberation movements that come from, universities and leftist institutions?
Okay, if I get what you're saying, yes. So if there are budding groups of people who groups in California or Seattle or whatever, if they're yeah, that's a good example. So thanks for bringing that. Your question was good too. Everyone's questions are great. Yes, so there are lots of people on the left who are horrified by certain states and their Neanderthal, abortion rules. They're trying to infringe on a woman's right, that kind of stuff. So yes, in general, certainly too, if they make principled arguments to say, why shouldn't we have the right to break away, if we don't agree with then yeah, I don't think we should just say, oh, shut up, libtard, you could say, shut your mouth, libtard. Saying shut up is kind of rude. Okay, but yes, as long as what they're saying is principle. But in fact, it's good strategically. Again, let me just stress that I want to sort of get this stuff on record and just to say to people, hey, do you agree if a group of people, overwhelmingly voted and they wanted to leave and they weren't going to persecute the dissenters, should they be allowed to break away and have their own, political autonomy? Especially if they're thinking about doing it for their own reasons, maybe them, again, it's kind of silly. They're not going to care if they go back on their word probably, but still, it's good to have it on paper for people to admit that. Yeah.
So I have a very similar question, just on a bit of a larger scale. So the libertarian microstate, Liberland, has a working relationship with the Somali secessionist movement in Somaliland. What do you think about, on a strategic level, cooperating internationally with not even libertarian, but just all secessionist movements, or at least ones that can pass some kind of litmus test between libertarians here and all over the world and just secessionist movements in general?
So are we saying to the U.S. Navy, we've got the Somali pirates to have our back? Is that what you're...
Yeah, exactly.
There's 1,000 kids with AK-47s who disagree, Mr. Biden. It's a joke. I'm a pacifist. Didn't Tom Hanks settle this question? All right. Okay, so, again, to be honest with you, I'm actually not as familiar with like the whole global. Again, this is fairly new to me, this stuff, because I'm more focused on economic issues, right? So I was always in favor of the right of secession, as a principled thing. So I'm not as familiar with the group, but yeah, again, especially if they're making sound arguments, that I think it's perfectly reasonable, yes, to join force, and partly to show that, again, the main point strategically could be to show this isn't just about slavery in the Old South. Like, this is a broader thing. This is a worldwide phenomenon. We've got one more? Okay, one more.
Okay. So this is like more of a specific mechanics question about, like, in the way that the market can assert itself to demand higher interest rates before the Fed wants to change their Fed funds rate. Like, that's more likely to affect medium and longer term treasuries, and is that basically that the secondary market of how treasuries trade are just going to reflect like that difference in its price versus its effective interest rate? Because like I guess my worry is it's going to happen in the next year, like through the next market bust. Trying to understand that.
Okay, so the question is like
they're going to be late on inflation, but the market is going to assert itself, expecting higher inflation before the Fed is going to do that. How do we actually see that happening? It's in what, medium and longer term treasuries, like the effective yields on those?
Okay, if I understand, like, so there's this phrase like bond vigilantes attacking and stuff. If they started to doubt what's going to happen, so right, I think you would see longer term like yields on 5, 10, 20, 30 year treasuries going up before the short-term ones, partly because if people are panicked, which is going to be the case, in a bad economy, they're treating treasuries almost like cash. And so that's why the yields are going to be low there, because everyone's going to want that. But again, if you're thinking the dollar might crash, you're not going to lend money out for 30 years at 1% interest or whatever, right? You're going to want a higher yield. So that's why, yes, if the Fed gradually starts losing control, it would be on the longer-term ones first. And yeah, so ultimately the Fed could just buy up all the treasuries. And believe me, there are people, economists, talking like this, just saying, the Fed's got plenty of ammo. We're not out of ammo. They could just buy up all the treasuries. And if that doesn't work, they start buying stocks, right? And these are reputable economists.
They set those SPVs in place last year to do so.
Right.
To justify it. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Give it up for Bob Murphy.